How to bind a quilt. Learn how to make different width bindings, miter those corners and stitch the binding in place too. Cutting the binding strips. First you need to decide how wide you want your finished binding to be once it's sewn on. Normally this is 1/4 inch for a quilt, but if you want to make it wider you can make it 1/2 inch. Or you can make it narrower or even wider again, but decide that before you start, and then I'll show you how to work out how wide the strip needs to be, depending on whether you want it to be 1/4 inch or wider. You then need to decide whether you want your finished binding to be single fold or double fold. A single fold binding is less hard wearing and great for edges where you don't need them to be hard wearing or if you're short of fabric. Here I've shown you the difference. On the blue sample, I've used a double fold binding. It's a lot more hard wearing and works well on the edge of a quilt, which might have wear. You can see here the fabric is folded over double, so it gives a nice strong edge. On the gold binding, I've just used a single fold binding, which doesn't look as bulky, but obviously won't be as hard wearing, so just make that decision. Now you need to do the maths. We're going to start off by calculating the binding strip width. Now if you've chosen single fold binding, you need to do the finished binding width times 4 plus 1/4. So in this example, 1/4 inch times 4 plus 1/4 is 1 1/4 inches. So your finished binding strip needs to be 1 1/4 inches wide. If you decide to do double fold binding, then you need to take your chosen finished width and multiply it by 8 and add 1/4 inch. That's just a little bit of the allowance for ease. So in this example, 1/4 inch times 8 plus 1/4 inch equals 2 1/4 inches. So that's how wide your finished binding needs to be cut if you're making double fold binding. Next, you need to work out the length of the binding you need so that it will fit all the way around your quilt. So what you need to do is measure all the way around your quilt. This is the perimeter of your quilt. And then you need to add 20 inches. This is for joining the strips. So in this example, I've measured all the way around my quilt. It was a 70-inch square quilt, so that made 280 inches. Add 20 inches, so your finished binding needs to be 300 inches long. So now you've worked out all the maths, you've worked out the width you need your strips to be, whether it's single fold or double fold, and you've also worked out the length it needs to be. So you need to cut all the strips to this length. Now obviously, unless you've got a very small quilt or very wide binding, you'll need to join the strips. So if you do the finished length, 300 divided by 42, which is the normal width of fabric, that's 7.14. Round it up to 8 strips. So you now need to cut 8 strips of 42-inch wide binding. So in this example, you'd need, if you work that out, you'll actually need 20 inches of fabric. So if you work that out at this stage, you know how much fabric you'll need to buy or find for your binding. Once you've worked that all out, cut all of the strips that you need to the width they need to be and the number of strips you've worked out that you need when you join them, and cut the selvages off because you don't want the selvages to be caught in the binding. So there's all the double fold strips. If you're going to do single fold binding, here's all the strips cut to the 1 1/4 inch length and the number of strips that you're going to need once joined together that will fit all the way around your quilt. And then we're going to show you how to join them together. Joining the binding. In the photos we've used blue fabric for the double fold binding and gold for the single, so you can see the difference. Now you're most likely going to have to join your binding strips to make one long length unless you've got very wide fabric or a small quilt. To start with, cut off the selvages because you don't want those to be caught in the binding. Cut the selvages off the end of all of the strips that you've cut. Now take the end of one of the strips and the end of the other strip and place the 2 strips right sides facing at right angles, making sure that the top and the side raw edges match up. Now mark a dot at the bottom where the bottom strip meets the top strip and draw a line diagonally across this corner. Now pin the 2 strips together, either side of the drawn line. Pin them far enough away from the drawn line so that you don't have to take out the pins when you're stitching, and this will keep the strips nice together and nice and stable. Now you need to sew them together along that drawn diagonal line. So place them under your machine Do a short reverse stitch at the beginning, stitch carefully all the way along the drawn line, and do a small reverse or lock stitch at the other end just to secure the seam. Once that's sewn, open out the strips and then open out the seam allowance and press it flat. Now put the seam allowances back together and trim them off to about 1/4 inch. This just reduces the bulk in the seam. And then to make sure that they stay flat, press them from the wrong side and turn it over and press it from the right side. This ensures that the seam allowances are flat and you've got a nice neat join. This is the join in a single fold binding, so you can see that the join won't be as visible because it's diagonal when it's actually folded and sewn to your quilt. And repeat this to join all the strips together that you've cut in exactly the same way. Now with a double fold binding, the process is exactly the same. Start off by trimming off those selvages from the ends of all of the strips. Then you can see that I had my strips folded together because that's how they came off the fabric, folded together, so it was just quicker to cut. Now place the end of one strip and the other end of another strip, right sides facing and at right angles. Mark the bottom point where the bottom strip meets the top strip with a little dot, and then draw that line. I've used a heat erasable pen for this so that when I press it, the pen mark will disappear. You could use a pencil as long as you draw lightly. Pin the two strips together either side of the drawn line, making sure you place the pins far enough away from the drawn line so you don't have to remove them while stitching. Then stitch them together along this drawn line. Do a small reverse or lock stitch at the beginning, stitch carefully so that you stitch exactly on the drawn line, and then do a small reverse stitch at the other end. This just stops it coming undone while you're binding your quilt. There's the drawn line stitched in place now. Now open up the two strips just like you did with the single fold binding. Open up the seam allowance and press it open and flat because it's easier to trim it when it's a bigger seam allowance and press it rather than when it's a smaller one. So it's easier to press it flat then trim it first. Then place it on your ironing board and press the seam open and flat again because it will have closed up a little bit during the trimming process. Turn it over to the other side so it's right sides up. Press it again just to make sure it's flat. So there's the double fold binding and the single fold binding. You can see they're joined together in the same way, and repeat this to join all of the binding strips together. Sewing a binding strip to a quilt. If you're using single fold binding, then leave the strip as it is because it will be sewn to your quilt just as one flat piece. If you've decided to use double fold binding, then you need to prepare this before you start sewing it to the quilt. So you need to fold the whole strip in half lengthways with wrong sides facing. If you've joined your bindings, it's easy to see where this is because where the joins are on the wrong side. So fold it in half with wrong sides facing and then work your way to one end of the binding to start. Fold the strip in half with wrong sides facing, making sure the raw long edges match up as you go. So fold a small section, making sure the raw edges match up, and then press. It's important to take time with this. You need a nice, neat pressed edge with a nice fold because it will make it easier and neater when sewn to your quilt if you've taken the time to press this so that it's neatly folded together. So work all the way along, hold the raw edges together and then press them. When you reach the join, it's important that stays open and flat, so just give it another little press and then hold it flat as you sew the binding strip, as you press the binding strip over, and then you know that those seam allowances are laying nice and flat inside. And then continue folding and pressing the binding strip in half, wrong sides together, all the way along until you have folded and pressed the whole binding strip. And your double fold binding is now ready to sew to your quilt. Now before you start stitch your binding to your quilt, you need to make another decision. The binding is machine stitched in place, but when you finish it, do you want to add machine stitch it in place to finish? You can see how I've done that here. So the binding is folded over to the front of the quilt, the plain fabric is the front, and then machine stitched. With this binding, I've hand sewn it in place to finish. So you can see the binding is folded over to the back of the quilt, and small slip stitches are worked to hold it in place. They're two very different finishes. Obviously the hand sewing takes longer, but the stitches are less visible, so you just need to choose. So if you're going to hand sew the binding to the quilt, then you need to sew the binding to the front of the quilt to start with. The front is the plain size. So fold it in half to find the centre of one side. This is the best place to start, and mark that with a pin. Now take your binding strip. It doesn't matter whether it's single or double, but take your binding strip and pin it so the raw short end matches up with that centre pin that you placed. I've used a longer pin here so that I can remember that's the centre of my quilt. Then pin it into place all the way down this first side, matching the raw edge of the binding to the edge of the quilt. Now measure 4 inches from the top of that binding and mark that point with a pin. That's where you're going to start sewing. And then you sew it in place and miter the corner, and I'll show you that in the next stage. Now if you want to machine finish your binding, then you need to sew the binding to the back of the quilt to start with. So you can see the back is the printed side of my quilt because I've got a printed backing. So match the raw edges of the binding. You can see how this works, that once it's machine stitched into place, you fold it over and you will machine stitch it on the front. So this is why you pin it to the back. The same process is whether you use double fold or single fold binding. It doesn't really matter. So I'm pinning this into place all the way down. But this is the difference. I'm just showing you here is whether that, if you were doing hand sewing, then you would pin it to the front. And if you're doing machine sewing, then you need to pin it to the back. So if we're going to do the machine sewn one, fold it in half, find the centre of one side, and place a pin. If you use a longer pin like I did earlier, then it's easier to remember later where the centre is, because that's where the binding will be joined later on. So measure 4 inches down from that centre pin. This is where you're going to start sewing. And then take your binding. Doesn't matter whether it's double fold or single fold, because the binding is sewn into place in the same way. If you're using double fold, then you will just be sewing through both layers. If you're using single fold, it will just be through one layer. So pin it into place, and where that 4-inch pin is, pop that into the top of the binding, and that's where you're going to start sewing. Pin it together all the way around down the first side like this, making sure the raw edges are matching. And then I'll show you how to miter the corner in the next step. Mitering a corner. So before you actually stitch this first pin side into place, you need to miter the corner. So start off by measuring and marking 1/4 inch up from the bottom of that corner. Just a quick note here, if your finished binding is more than 1/4 inch, if it's different, then what you're doing is measuring the seam allowance distance up from that corner. So if you've decided to have 1/2 inch binding, measure 1/2 inch. But for this, I'm measuring 1/4 inch up from the corner and 1/4 inch in from the side edges. Make a point mark where those points cross and draw a diagonal line into the corner. Now you need to stitch the first side of this binding into place. So place the binding under your machine and remember to start stitching 4 inches down from the top of the binding so that you've got 4 inches of binding that's loose and unstitched. You leave this gap for joining later, so this is important. Now, using your chosen seam allowance, I'm using 1/4 inch here. Stitch the binding to the edge of the quilt all the way down until you reach that little marked dot that you put in earlier that's 1/4 inch from the bottom and 1/4 inch from the side. Leave the needle down at that point, pivot the quilt, lower the presser foot again and stitch diagonally into that corner along the line that you marked and do a little reverse stitch to finish. And then take out the quilt and the binding from under your machine. You can see there's the diagonal line that I've stitched into the corner. Now once that's done, place the whole quilt on your ironing board so that the top sewn edge is laying horizontally. Take the loose binding strip, the loose end that's unstitched, fold it upwards so that the raw edge lies in a line with the raw edge of the quilt, and you've got a diagonal line of binding, and give that a little press and just pin it into place just close to that left hand edge. Then fold the binding strip back down so that the folded edge is level with that horizontal edge and that the raw edges are all matching, and give that another press. And then just pin that into place. You can then take out the first pin underneath if you want, or just leave it there, but just make sure if you don't sew over it. I usually take it out and put it back on top just to secure the first edge. Now pin the binding strip into place, matching raw edges all the way down until you reach the next corner, then mark and mitre it in exactly the same way as you did the first one. Now, if you're doing single fold binding, the process is exactly the same. You can see I've started stitching it 4 inches from the top of the strip all the way down and sewn that diagonal corner. Turn the quilt round so that the stitched edge is laying horizontally. Fold the loose end of the binding strip upwards so that the raw edges are in a line. Give it a press. Pin it into place just to hold it while you fold it back down, making sure that the folded edge is level with the top raw edge. Press it into place and then pin. You can remove the underneath pin now if you want and put that on top. Pin it together all the way down that raw edge and sew to the bottom. Now you can see with this double fold binding I have mitred all 4 corners and then sewn down the final side, stopping 4 inches above that centre mark, and we'll go into more detail about this in the next step. Now you can see how the mitre, when you fold the corner over, it's got a lovely neat diagonal mitre, which will give you a really neat finish to your quilt. If we look at the single fold one, again I've mitred all the corners, stopped 4 inches above the centre pin, and you can see how nice and neat they are. When you open them up, just like with the double fold binding, you've got a nice, neat diagonal edge. And we're going to show you how to join in the next step. Joining the ends of the binding. Once you've mitred all the way around the quilt, you can join the ends of the binding. So you can see I've left the binding unstitched 4 inches down from the centre pin and 4 inches up from the centre pin. This leaves an 8-inch gap of binding unstitched, which you need to be able to join it together. So you can see here, I'm just measuring just to show you that I've got 8 inches unstitched either side of that central pin. So turn it round so that the joined edge is facing you. Now take the starting end, and it will finish at that pin because that's where you pinned it into place to start with, but just pin it back into place to hold it. Now take the finishing end, and that needs to lie on top of the starting end, overlapping it. Now it needs to overlap the starting end by the same width as the binding. So you can either measure your binding strip. If it's double fine fold binding, you need to open it, or you can just do this. If you take the end of your binding, you should have some left over, and just snip it off. You can use that as a tape measure because obviously it needs to overlap the top end needs to overlap the bottom end by the same width as the binding. So if you cut off a little strip, that is exactly the width of the binding, and mark that. The other way you can do it is just measure the strip and mark it on, but you must remember if you're using double fold binding, it's got to be the full width of the strip, not the folded width. So once that's overlapped, I like to make sure that I've got a nice straight edge for joining it together. I use a ruler to just draw a line so that I can match up that horizontal line on the raw edge, and then draw a line to make sure it's nice and straight. Double check before you cut anything that it's overlapping the starting end by the same width and not shorter than, it's got to be overlapping, and then trim it off. The binding strip is now exactly the right size to be able to join, so it will fit your quilt. So now we're going to join the two ends together in exactly the same way as you do when you join binding strips right at the beginning. Open up the binding strip and place the starting end and the finishing end right sides facing, as you can see I'm doing here. And make sure they're at right angles, just like when you joined lengths of binding strips. So right sides facing at right angles. So match together the raw edges, the top raw edge and the side raw edges. Then you've got to sew them together diagonally, just like you did when you joined binding strips. So lay the top one on top of the bottom one and mark the point on the top strip where the bottom one meets it underneath. And then you need to draw a diagonal line across this. You may find it easier to just unpin the two strips at this point. So take your ruler, then lay it out flat. Remember, we're drawing on the wrong side. Take your ruler. You might have to rearrange this slightly to get the right angle, but draw a line from that marked point up to the top left corner. Now place the two strips together again, the two ends of the strips, right sides facing, just like you've just done, matching the side and the top raw edges. And then pin them together. Obviously, because you've got it already joined to the quilt, you need to have to fiddle it around a bit, but because it's joined to the quilt and the quilt is fabric, you can fold it quite easily. Now sew the two strips together along the drawn line. You can pop extra pins in if you want to hold it nice and stable. So just pop it under your machine and sew along that drawn line. Now take out the pins and open up the seam allowance so that it's flat. Just like this. Again, this is the same method we did when joining strips at the beginning. So give that a press so it's nice and flat. And then trim the seam allowance to about 1/4 inch. And then open it out again just to make sure it's lying nice and flat, because you want it flat inside the binding. It's to give you a neater finish. Now with your double fold binding, fold it back in half again, wrong sides together, and give it a quick press. Make sure those seam allowances are lying flat inside. Then pin the binding back in place to the quilt, so you can see it fits exactly now. You've got a diagonal join which reduces bulk. It matches all the diagonal joins on the quilt, so you won't be able to see where the quilt ends start and finish. Now sew it back into place, overlapping the beginning and end of the other sewing lines and reverse stitching as well. When you've done that, it's finished. You have joined the binding around your quilt with a really nice, neat join. Now, if you're joining the ends of the single fold binding, it's done in exactly the same way, except you don't have to unfold it. So start and stop stitching 8 inches from that centre pin, overlap the top strip onto the bottom strip, and then trim the top strip so that it is the same width of the binding, longer than the bottom strip. Again, you can measure this, or you can cut a strip off the end of your binding and use that as a measuring tool. It's entirely up to you. I'm just going to measure it here because I want to make sure that it overlaps exactly the same. So the strip is 1 1/4 inches wide. It overlaps the bottom by 1 1/4 inches. So now I can just draw a straight line and cut it. So I'll draw it on top of that and then trim along that line. And now the top strip overlaps the bottom strip by the width of the binding strip. So all you have to do now is place those two pieces right sides facing at right angles, sew them together in exactly the same way as you did with the double fold strip, and join the binding to the quilt. Finishing the binding. So once you've sewn your binding all the way around the quilt, I'm going to show you the two different methods. This is how to finish off a single fold binding. First of all, fold the binding over and open and just press it all the way around. Then turn it over to the other side of the quilt and fold the long raw edge over so that it meets up exactly with the edge of the quilt. So you can see I've folded the raw edge, the long edge, so it meets up with the edge of the quilt. Do this either side of one corner and just press it into place. Now if you're doing a machine stitch binding, this will be on the other side of the quilt. Because this is going to be a hand stitched one, then you can see I've folded it over to the back of the quilt. If you're going to do a machine stitch binding, it will be the other side, but the method is the same. Once you've folded over the edge, you can now fold it under again, and you can pin it into place so it only just covers the seam. So the long raw edge is tucked underneath, and then fold it so it just covers the seam. Fold it into place either side of the corner, because it's easier if you sew the long edges, pin the long edges into place and then sort out the corner. So making sure the raw edge is tucked under because you've pressed that before, fold it so it just covers the seam and pin it into place. Now when you get to the corner, fold the corner upwards into a point and give it a little press just like this, and then fold it over on top, and that will create a little point in the corner, which is a mitered corner. So if you make sure that you fold one side up and press and then the other side, then you'll get a mitered corner on the edge, and then you can pin the rest of the binding round the side. So continue doing this all the way around the edge of the quilt, working on the side bits either side of the corners, then doing the corners. So fold the raw edge over so it meets up with the edge of the quilt, and then fold the whole thing over to enclose all the raw edges. Make sure everything's tucked underneath and pin it into place so it just covers the seam. Now if you're going to do double fold binding, then it will look like this. You've already machine sewn it on all round, so all you need to do is fold it open again and just press it open and flat. Now you can see I sewed this to the back of the quilt because I'm going to do a machine stitch binding for this one, and then I'm going to be folding it over to the front. If you've chosen to do a hand stitch one, you'll be on the other side, but the method for pinning the binding into place is the same, whatever your finish. So now turn the quilt over to the other side, and all you have to do is, because you've got a double fold binding, there's no turning raw edges under because they're already encased. Just turn over that folded edge so it just covers the seam and pin it into place. So you can see that working with a double fold binding is easier because all the raw edges are already folded under. So the same with the single fold it into place either side of the corner to start with, so it's just covering the seam. Then press the binding upwards into a point, and then turn the other side over and fold that downwards, and then you'll get two nice little sloped edges that meet at the corner to create a nice neat mitered corner. You can see on the other side it's exactly the same. Now all you have to do is repeat that to pin it in place all the way around to the edge of the quilt. And then it will look like this. So the double fold binding is now pinned all the way around the edge of the quilt. So if we're going to do a machine stitched finish here, then simply put the binding underneath your sewing machine and stitch close to the edge. I would use a slightly longer stitch, like a number 3 stitch, and stitch it very close, 2 millimeters, a 1/16 of an inch from the edge. When you get to the corner, stitch slowly up to the corner, put the needle down in the corner, lift the presser foot, turn it round, lower the presser foot and stitch back down the other edge. This will hold the corner neatly in place. And now if you look at the front, you will see you've just got a nice neat machine stitch line holding your binding in the place. And this stitching will be on the front side of the quilt. Once you've stitched all the way round and you've got back to where you started, overlap the beginning of the stitches and do a couple of reverse stitches and then cut the thread to finish. So now you can see this is the binding finished. On the front of the quilt you can see a machine stitched line, which as long as you keep it nice and straight, it will give a nice finish. It's stronger than a hand stitch finish, but obviously the stitches are visible. So this is the front of the quilt finished with nice neat mitered corners and everything joined neatly all the way round. Now for a hand stitch finish, you will have folded your binding over to the back of the quilt. So to thread a length of thread that matches your binding into your needle, push the needle through about 1 inch away from the edge of the quilt, but only through the backing fabric layer, not through the top, and then work a couple of tiny stitches on top of each other. This is just to secure the thread. Now you need to work a slip stitch. So take a long stitch through the backing fabric only, and then you can see, just check every now and then that it is through the backing fabric only, and into the binding strip. Take a vertical stitch over into the backing fabric and long stitch through the backing fabric and out through the binding. So you can see I'm doing a long stitch under the backing fabric, coming up in the binding, a vertical stitch back in and under the backing fabric again. Check every now and then to make sure that you haven't gone through to the front of the quilt, because all the stitches must be just under the backing fabric. When you get to the corner, work a couple of stitches on top of each other just to hold that corner in place. And then I also like to work one other little stitch halfway up that corner. It just helps to secure it. This is why if you use a thread to match your binding, your stitches are less likely to be seen. And then sew that down, but again, only through the binding, not through to the front. And then start stitching down the other side in the same way. Long stitch under the backing fabric, out through the binding, tiny vertical stitch across and into the backing fabric. And you can make these stitches in just one motion. So across, under and out. Checking all the time to make sure that you haven't come out through the top fabric. So through, out, over, through the backing stitches, out through the binding fabric, and remove the pins as you go. Now when you finish a length of thread, I'm just going to show you this a little bit earlier because I haven't finished my length of thread. To secure it, all you need to do is work a couple of small stitches on top of each other just to secure, and then take the thread through the backing fabric only, a couple of inches away so that the end is lying inside the quilt, and then give the thread a little tug, snip it, and the end will fall underneath there and lie inside. And with the starting length of thread, just snip off the end, and that's a more secure method, and continue doing that to stitch all the way around the edge of the quilt. And this is it finished. So this is your hand stitched binding. All you can see from the back of the quilt are small neat stitches. It does give it a more handmade feel. On the front of the quilt, it's neater. You won't see any stitches at all. So unlike the machine stitch one, you won't see any stitching. But obviously the hand stitch one takes longer. But that gives a nice neat finish to your quilt.